The laughter came first, sharp, careless, bouncing across the pavement of the city square like stones thrown at glass. A cluster of uniformed officers leaned against their cruiser, smirking at the sight of the frail, gray-bearded man hunched over a trash bin. His coat was torn at the sleeves, the fabric stiff with dirt and rain, and his boots were worn down to thin leather that barely clung to his feet. He looked like the very image of despair, and they treated him as such. One of the officers mocked his gait, exaggerating the shuffle of age and hunger, while another snorted and called out that the vagrant should move along before he scared the decent people away. The old man did not respond. His back curved like a question mark, his thin fingers carefully sorting through discarded wrappers as though each scrap carried a secret worth keeping. The more he ignored them, the bolder their ridicule became. Their laughter spilled into the crowd that passed by, some pretending not to hear, others staring with the quiet discomfort of those too afraid to interfere. The injustice hung heavy, as if the air itself demanded someone break the silence. But he did not. He simply continued his search, eyes steady, movements calm. There was something in that silence, though, a weight unspoken, a dignity invisible to those who only saw rags and weakness. And then, without warning, the laughter died. It didn't taper off. It snapped away, smothered by the sight of shadows moving swiftly across the square. From the edges of the crowd came men in uniform, their steps purposeful, their eyes locked on the frail figure by the trash bin. They did not jeer. They did not question. They stopped, aligned in perfect symmetry, and raised their hands in solemn salute. The policemen froze, the color draining from their faces. Around them, the bystanders gasped, confused, drawn into the gravity of the moment. The old man, still bent at the waist, still searching as though the world had forgotten him, had suddenly become the axis around which the square turned. For the men saluting were Navy SEALs, their posture unyielding, their respect carved deep into their very bones. The old man had a name once that carried weight, Samuel Hayes. To most now, he was simply another forgotten soul adrift on city streets. But to those who knew, to those who had served, he was a legend. Years before, Samuel had been a pillar of strength, a man whose presence steadied others in the chaos of battle. His service began when he was barely more than a boy, enlisting straight out of high school with hands calloused from farm work and eyes still bright with the innocence of youth. He had carried within him no illusions of glory, only the steady resolve of someone who believed in duty more than comfort. The Navy tested him, pushed him to the edges of endurance, and found in him a will that refused to break. He became one of the few, the chosen. A SEAL, forged in saltwater and sleepless nights, molded by the relentless demand for perfection. In the years that followed, Samuel's name whispered across bases and briefing rooms. Missions classified and buried in silence bore his fingerprints. Brothers in arms knew him not as a man who boasted, but as one who stood unflinching when storms raged hardest. But the weight of service leaves marks that metals cannot mend. Samuel bore the cost in silence, carrying the memory of comrades who never returned. He remembered the metallic tang of blood in desert air, the shout swallowed by gunfire, the unbearable stillness after the last echo faded. He remembered the face of his closest friend, Thomas Reed, who had died shielding others from an explosion. That night, under foreign skies, Samuel had cradled what was left of him, whispering promises that the world would never know the name of their sacrifice but that he would never forget. He never did. When Samuel finally left the service, he returned to a country that had moved on without him. Civilians saw only an aging man, not the battles etched into the lines of his face. Work was scarce. His body, once honed into a weapon, began to betray him with pain that crept into his joints and lungs that rattled with every winter wind. Bills piled higher than his pension, and soon he found himself stripped of the simple dignities, his home, his bed, his place in a world he had defended. And so, he faded into the streets. Yet the warrior within never vanished. He still rose before dawn, folding his meager belongings with military precision. He still stood a little taller when he caught a reflection in a shop window, reminding himself that his spine was steel even when the world treated him as dust. The police officers did not know this history when they mocked him. To them, he was a nuisance to be moved along, a shadow cluttering the edges of their clean streets. Their laughter came not from malice alone, but from ignorance, a blindness to the stories carried within broken bodies. And so the conflict deepened, authority pressing down upon silent dignity, while the crowd's uneasy quiet stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. One officer nudged his companion and said they should check his bag, certain that a man like him must be hiding something foul. Another chuckled that maybe the vagrant fancied himself a soldier once, given the rigid way he folded his blanket. The words were laced with contempt, heavy with the kind of arrogance born from never having stood on the edge of mortality. Still, Samuel did not speak. His silence was not submission. It was defiance, a shield that neither insults nor authority could pierce. He had faced storms that drowned men in fear. He would not lower himself to wrestle in the mud of their mockery. Instead, he remained steady, his breath slow, his eyes distant, as though he could see beyond their narrow world into a horizon only he understood. Then came the shift, the subtle foreshadowing of justice. A young man in the crowd noticed the patch sewn into the lining of Samuel's torn coat. It was faded, threads fraying, but unmistakable to those who knew, the insignia of the SEALs. The boy, whose brother currently served, felt his chest tighten. He pulled out his phone, fingers trembling, and sent a message to a contact in the local veterans community. Word spread quicker than the officers realized, a whisper turning into a wave. Minutes later, the SEALs appeared. Not in parade formation, not for spectacle, but with the quiet gravity of men honoring one of their own. Their boots struck the pavement in rhythm, their eyes sharp with recognition. Without hesitation, they formed a line before the old man and raised their hands in crisp, unwavering salute. The crowd hushed into reverent silence. The mockery had been shattered, exposed for what it was. The policemen stood paralyzed, their authority stripped away not by confrontation but by the overwhelming presence of honor. Their laughter, so loud minutes before, now seemed obscene against the quiet respect that filled the square. Samuel finally lifted his head, his gaze moving slowly across the men who saluted him. His eyes, once dulled by years of hardship, shone again with a glimmer of recognition. He did not smile. He did not weep. But he nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible gesture that spoke more than words ever could. One of the SEALs, his voice low but steady, broke the silence. He spoke not to the crowd, not to the officers, but to Samuel alone, that they had not forgotten. That men like him were never truly abandoned. That even in rags, his name carried weight greater than any uniform worn without understanding. And Samuel, still silent, finally allowed a truth to pass his lips, his voice rasped but unbroken. He said that a uniform is not cloth but sacrifice. That respect is not granted by titles, but by the lives one is willing to lay down for others. And then he said nothing more, because nothing more was needed. Those words carved themselves into the hearts of everyone who heard. People who had once turned away now straightened their backs, ashamed of their silence. The policemen, their arrogance burned away, lowered their eyes in shame, the badges on their chests suddenly feeling heavier than lead. The moment stretched, timeless, a tableau of justice restored. The crowd, once passive, now erupted, not in noise, but in a wave of reverent stillness. Strangers removed their hats. Mothers pulled children closer, whispering that they should remember what they had just witnessed. The SEALs held their salute until Samuel, with trembling effort, straightened his back and returned it. It was not the sharp gesture of a young soldier, but the unyielding statement of a man who had carried the weight of wars within him. That salute was his last weapon, his final shield, and in that square, it won a victory greater than any battle before. When the SEALs finally lowered their hands, they stepped forward, gathering around Samuel not as charity but as brothers reclaiming one of their own. They offered him no pity, only belonging. They lifted his worn bag with the same respect one might carry a flag. Together, they guided him away from the square, leaving the silence heavy behind them. For the policemen, no punishment could equal the shame of that moment. Their authority had been dwarfed by a truth they could not command. Respect is not enforced but earned. The crowd knew it. The SEALs knew it. And Samuel Hayes, who had borne silence as his shield, had reminded them all. Later, those who had witnessed it would share the story, online in whispers, in classrooms and homes. They repeated his words, holding them close like a compass pointing toward dignity. They spoke of the old man who, though homeless and worn, carried a strength that outshone the very men who mocked him. Respect is not in the uniform, but in the sacrifice. A week later, Samuel was no longer seen by the trash bins. He had been taken into the fold of those who still remembered, offered shelter not as a handout but as a homecoming. He spent his days quietly, speaking little, often sitting in the sun with eyes closed as if listening to voices from long ago. Yet the city square remained haunted by his story. People who had once rushed past the homeless now paused, wondering what unseen battles they might carry. The officers, humbled, found themselves slower to judge, their laughter caught in their throats whenever arrogance tempted them. And so the legacy of that day endured, not in medals or parades, but in the simple truth carved into the hearts of strangers, that honor hides in places the world overlooks, and that the silence of the forgotten can thunder louder than the shouts of the powerful. For those who heard the story, the question remained, how many heroes walk among us, unseen, until respect calls them back into the light? And to every viewer who listens now, the story asks gently, where are you watching from? What unseen strength lives in the corners of your own streets? Share your thoughts, share your respect, and remember to subscribe, because the world holds countless untold stories of silent heroes waiting to be honored.